Under the silent stretch of a pale desert sky, dust spiraled lazily in the wind around the half-broken fences of the abandoned rancher. It had been years since anyone had lived there, years since laughter or sorrow had echoed inside its weather-worn walls. The wooden beams groaned under the weight of time, but there was still a strange vitality lingering in the air, as if the place had been waiting. He had not expected to return. Life had dragged him back. Circumstances, debts, and a restless spirit that would not let him stay still. He came not for comfort but for answers. The ranch had belonged to his family once, a place built with calloused hands and endless days beneath the sun. Now it was a ruin, its silence thick enough to unsettle any man. Yet when he stepped across the threshold, something stirred. It was not just the echo of memory, but something more immediate, alive. He had not noticed her at first. Shadows clung to the corners of the old ranch, and his boots made the only sound. Then, as he pushed open a door swollen by dampness, there she was. A young woman, her hair dark as midnight and her gaze fixed with an intensity that sent a jolt through his chest. She looked as if she belonged to the place, as though the house had hidden her all these years and revealed her only now. Her skin carried a glow untarnished by hardship, and her eyes held the kind of innocence that both disarmed and unsettled. Her presence made no sense. She stood in silence for a long while, watching him as though she had been expecting his return. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled at first but then steadied, filled with a strange conviction. "You're going to have sex with me." The words crashed against the silence of the ranch like a stone shattering glass. He froze, his breath tightening in his chest. He saw no mockery in her face, no cruelty, no hint of jest. Only an unshaken resolve, as if what she had spoken was not a request but an inevitable truth. Confusion rippled through him. He studied her, searching for explanation. Why a woman, untouched and unspoiled, would stand in a forgotten ruin and speak with such certainty. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, betraying nerves, yet her eyes never faltered. She was a virgin, her innocence unmasked not by words but by the fragile tremor beneath her courage. And yet she carried herself with the gravity of fate, as if her life had been moving toward this single declaration. He felt the ground shift beneath him. There was a weight in her words that pressed upon him more than desire ever could. This was not simply a matter of flesh, it was something carved deeper, something that connected to the unexplainable. He had lived long enough to know when destiny laid its hand upon a man, and now it pressed firmly against his chest. Still, he struggled to breathe beneath the enormity of it. The woman was unyielding in her gaze, but behind that fire was a vulnerability so raw it made him ache. She had chosen him, not by accident, not by desperation, but by something older and more mysterious. Her soul called to his in that quiet ranch where the world had long ago forgotten to look. He stepped closer, slowly, as though approaching a wild creature that might vanish if startled. The air between them tightened, charged with something neither of them could name but both of them felt. His heart pounded not with lust, but with a fierce sense of responsibility. She had given him her words, her trust, her fate. To deny or to accept her would shape not just this moment but the rest of their lives. Her lips parted, trembling not with fear but with the sheer magnitude of what she had declared. He reached out, his hand pausing in the air before daring to touch her shoulder. The warmth of her skin, beneath his calloused fingers, made her shiver, but she did not step away. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, surrendering to something greater than herself. The walls of the ranch seemed to lean closer, bearing witness. The silence was no longer empty but full, vibrating with the collision of two lives meant to meet in this abandoned place. He realized then that her words had not been born of recklessness. They had come from years of waiting, of knowing somehow that he would return to this forgotten home, and that when he did, he would find her. And now she stood before him, a virgin woman bound not by chains but by choice, demanding the fulfillment of what she believed destiny had written for them both. He could feel the pulse of her heart racing against the quiet of the ranch, could sense the storm of innocence and courage raging within her. It was not lust that gripped him, nor mere attraction, but something far heavier, an awareness that he had stumbled upon a covenant older than either of them. He saw in her eyes a plea for him not to dismiss her truth, not to break the fragile thread that tied them together. He breathed in deeply, tasting the dust of memory and the sharpness of her resolve. In that moment, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. The wind sighed across the barren desert plain, scattering fine dust over the old fences that sagged under years of neglect. The ranch stood like a monument to abandonment, its roof half collapsed, its walls bearing the scars of storms and time. He hadn't wanted to come back, yet something had pulled him, something deeper than memory, heavier than nostalgia. When he stepped through the broken gate, the air seemed to shift, almost as though the land itself exhaled after holding its breath too long. His boots crunched against dry earth, and the wooden porch groaned beneath his weight. He felt the ghosts of his childhood in every creak, every shadow. The ranch had belonged to his father, then to no one. Now it belonged to the desert, or so he thought. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old timber. Sunlight leaked through shattered windows, carving golden blades through the gloom. He moved cautiously, his hand brushing against the chipped frame of the door, the air heavy with silence. And then he saw her. She stood in the back room, half shielded by the dimness, her form still and almost ethereal. For a moment he thought she was an apparition, a trick of light and memory. But her chest rose and fell, and her eyes, dark and piercing, fixed on him with a gaze so intense it rooted him in place. She didn't flinch, didn't startle at the intrusion, as though she had been waiting for him. His breath caught. She was young, untouched by the grit of the world outside. Her hair tumbled like a river down her shoulders, her skin pale against the shadowed walls. She seemed impossibly out of place in the ruin, like a secret the house had guarded all these years. Neither spoke for a long time. His pulse hammered in his ears, his instincts battling confusion. Then, with a voice trembling at first but settling into unshakable certainty, she broke the silence. "You're going to have sex with me." The words struck him like a storm. His body stiffened, his mind whirled. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. She had spoken with such conviction, so absolute, that denial seemed almost absurd. He searched her eyes for mockery or madness, but there was none. Only fire. He finally found his voice. "What did you say?" Her chin lifted, though her fingers twitched at her sides, betraying nerves. "You heard me." His throat felt dry. He stepped closer, cautious, his instincts tangled in disbelief. "Do you even know what you're saying?" "I know exactly," she replied, her voice steady now, though he could see the shiver that ran through her body. "I've waited, and I knew you would come back." The words chilled him more than the desert wind. Waited. For him. He studied her carefully, trying to make sense of her presence. The ranch had been abandoned for years. Who was she? Why was she here? "You don't even know who I am," he said slowly. Her eyes didn't waver. "I know enough. You are the one this place belongs to. And you are the one meant for me." He almost laughed at the absurdity, but the weight of her gaze silenced him. There was no madness there, only certainty, terrifying and magnetic. He felt drawn to her, even as his mind screamed questions. He raked a hand through his hair, pacing a step back. "You shouldn't be here. This place, it's no home. And you can't just say things like that to a stranger." She took a step forward, her bare feet silent against the cracked wooden floor. "Stranger, no. You've been here all along. In the stories, in the silence, I've lived with the shadow of you, waiting for the day you would walk through that door." His chest tightened. There was something in her voice, a mix of innocence and destiny, that unnerved him more than any threat ever had. He had lived a hard life, seen hunger, betrayal, even violence. But nothing had prepared him for the force of this young woman's certainty. He tried again, softer this time. Why me? Why here? Her eyes glistened in the dim light. Because I belong to you. Because this place belongs to you. And because it was always meant to happen here. He swallowed hard, unsettled. Her words carried the weight of prophecy, yet her trembling hands betrayed her vulnerability. She was a virgin. He could see it in the raw fragility beneath her boldness. She was terrified, but she was standing her ground. You don't even know my name, he whispered. I don't need to, she said. Names fade. What matters doesn't. The air between them grew heavy, charged with something unexplainable. He felt torn between two forces, one urging him to run, to escape this strange, dangerous pull, the other anchoring him, binding him to her by threads unseen. At last, he asked the question gnawing at him. How long have you been here? She looked around the room, her expression softening. Long enough to know every sound this house makes. Long enough to feel its loneliness. Long enough to wait for you. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He felt the desert pressing in around the ranch, as though the whole world had shrunk to the space between them. You can't mean what you said, he murmured. Her lips parted, her voice breaking with quiet desperation. I do, more than anything I've ever spoken. You think I don't understand, that I don't know what it means. But I do. I've guarded myself, held myself, saved myself, not for anyone else, only for you. And now you're here. Her confession struck him like thunder. He saw no deception, no ulterior motive, only truth, raw and painful in its honesty. He stepped closer without realizing it, until he could see the pulse beating at the hollow of her throat. She trembled beneath his gaze, but she didn't retreat. You don't know what you're asking, he whispered. Her eyes shimmered with tears she refused to shed. Yes, I do. I'm asking you not to leave me untouched by the life I was meant for. I'm asking you to see me, to claim me, to make me yours. That's why I've waited. That's why I endured the silence of this house. Because you were coming. The words dug into him, leaving scars he hadn't expected. He wanted to argue, to break free from the weight of her belief, but something in her gaze trapped him. It was as though the ranch itself had conspired to bring them together, and resisting would be like trying to fight the desert wind. He reached out before he could stop himself, his hand trembling as it brushed her shoulder. Her skin was warm, her breath caught sharply, and her eyes fluttered shut for a moment as though that single touch had sealed something sacred. When she opened them again, her gaze was luminous, filled with devotion that burned brighter than fear. You don't have to be afraid, she whispered. I'm not. His chest heaved with the weight of the moment. Afraid. Yes, he was afraid. Afraid of her innocence, her certainty, the force of destiny that seemed to wrap around them like chains. Afraid of what it would mean if he gave in. Afraid of what it would mean if he didn't. Outside, the desert wind howled against the walls, but inside, the silence roared louder. They stood at the precipice of something neither could name, and in her eyes, he saw the truth. This was not chance. This was fate, relentless and unyielding. And as he looked at her, trembling but unbroken, he knew nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The morning broke quietly, as if the world itself was wary of disturbing the fragile peace that had settled overnight. Pale sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, painting the room in muted gold. The woman stirred beneath the blanket draped over her body slow to wake but her heart already restless. She hadn't realized she'd fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, but the warmth had lulled her into the first dreamless slumber she'd had in days. When she opened her eyes fully, she saw the boy curled up on a small rug, his boots abandoned by the hearth, one arm clutching a threadbare toy rabbit. His breathing was soft, his chest rising and falling with the ease of trust. Trust in this home, trust in his father, trust, astonishingly, in her. The father was already awake. She noticed him by the window, coffee mug in hand, shoulders squared against the early light. He turned when he felt her gaze. There was no surprise in his eyes, only quiet acknowledgement, as though he had expected her to still be there. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice carrying that steady calm she was beginning to recognize as his nature. She nodded, drawing the blanket tighter. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to fall asleep here." "No need for apologies," he replied. "You needed rest." That much was clear. He crossed the room, placing a steaming cup of tea on the table near her. She hesitated, then wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her chilled fingers. It felt almost intimate, that simple gesture, and she lowered her eyes to hide the rush of emotion it stirred. The boy stirred then, mumbling something in his half-sleep. His father knelt beside him, smoothing his hair back with tender care. The sight struck her harder than she expected. She thought of the man who had promised to meet her, of how easily he had abandoned her. And here was another man, one who never abandoned the child who depended on him most. She took a sip of tea to steady herself. "Your son is remarkable," she said quietly. The man smiled faintly, though shadows lingered in his eyes. "He carries more than a child should. He lost his mother young, but he hasn't lost his ability to hope. Sometimes I think he's the one keeping me from falling apart." She nodded, understanding more than she wished to admit. Hope was fragile, yet in the boy, it burned so fiercely it could ignite those around him. The boy awoke fully a short while later, his first act to run straight to her side. "You're still here," he exclaimed, his eyes bright with relief. She smiled, though her heart clenched at the weight of his words. "Yes, I'm still here." "Good," he said firmly, as though her presence had been a matter of destiny rather than chance. Then he looked at his father with all the seriousness his small frame could carry. "See, Daddy, she didn't leave." The man only chuckled softly, ruffling his son's hair. But when his eyes met hers, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the boy's hope was binding them together in ways neither of them had planned. Later, they sat together outside, the sun climbing higher, the world slowly shaking off the remnants of the storm. The boy chased after a ball in the yard, his laughter spilling like music into the morning air. She and the man sat on the wooden steps, silence stretching between them but not suffocating. Finally, he spoke. "I should explain. About us." She turned to him, waiting. "I was married young," he began, his voice low. "We didn't have much, but we had each other. Then she fell ill, too quickly, too cruelly. By the time we understood what was happening, it was too late. She was gone before we could even say goodbye properly." His hands tightened around his mug, knuckles whitening. "I tried to be enough for my son, tried to carry both roles. Some days I think I've done well. Other days, I wonder if all he sees is the emptiness she left behind." She felt her throat tighten. Loss was a language she understood, though hers was not through death but through abandonment. She wanted to reach out, to tell him he had done more than enough, that the boy's light was proof of his love. But the words tangled in her chest. Instead, she whispered, "He sees you. And that's more than many children ever get." The man's eyes flickered toward her, gratitude softening the edges of his pain. "And what about you?" he asked gently. "What story were you carrying at that station?" Her breath caught. For a moment she thought of hiding, of brushing it off with some half-truth. But his gaze was steady, not prying but patient, waiting for her to decide. So she told him about the letters, the promises, the hope that had drawn her here. About the 3 days she had waited, clinging to every whistle of arriving trains, only to find nothing but silence. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to finish. "I thought it meant I wasn't worth being chosen," she whispered. His response was immediate, firm but quiet. "Or it meant he wasn't worthy of choosing you." Her eyes stung, and she looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his words. He didn't know her, not really, and yet he had spoken the very truth she hadn't dared let herself believe. The boy returned then, ball in hand, cheeks flushed. He plopped himself between them, leaning comfortably against her side as though he had claimed her already. "When people leave," he said matter-of-factly, "it hurts. But sometimes new people come, and they make it better." She looked down at him, startled by the wisdom in his childish voice. "And you think I'm one of those people?" He nodded fiercely. "I know you are." His father exhaled, a mixture of resignation and awe. "He's stubborn, if you haven't noticed." She laughed softly, though tears threatened at the edges of her vision. "I think I have." Days passed, blurring together in a rhythm she hadn't expected. Each morning, she thought she would leave. Each evening, she found another reason to stay. The boy clung to her presence with joyful certainty, while the father allowed her space but never pushed her away. She helped with small things, meals, laundry, reading stories at night. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a stranger's home and more like a place where she belonged. One evening, as the boy drifted to sleep with his head on her lap, she caught the father watching her from across the room. His gaze was unreadable, but something in it made her pulse quicken. "Why are you still here?" he asked quietly when the boy was asleep. She hesitated, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. "Because he asked me to stay. And if he hadn't," she met his eyes then, heart pounding. "Maybe I would have left. Maybe I would still be lost. But I think I needed someone to remind me I still mattered." And he did that. The man's expression softened, his weariness lifting just enough to reveal something deeper, something dangerous in its tenderness. "He's not the only one who sees that." Silence fell, heavy with meaning. Neither of them moved, but in that stillness, something shifted, something fragile, undeniable, terrifying in its possibility. It wasn't love yet, but it was the spark of it, the spark she thought she'd lost forever. Weeks later, she stood again at the train station. But this time, she was not alone. The boy held one hand, the father the other, and together they watched the trains come and go. She felt no longing now, no ache for someone who had broken his promise. She felt only the quiet certainty that her waiting had led her here, to this moment, to these two souls who had given her a place to belong. The boy looked up at her, grinning. "So, will you marry my daddy?" She laughed, startled, her cheeks burning. She glanced at the father, who shook his head with a smile that was equal parts exasperation and fondness. "Not everything can be decided by a child," he said gently. "But some things," she whispered, her voice trembling as she met his eyes, "can be decided by the heart." The train roared past, wind whipping through the station. She didn't look for the man who had abandoned her. She didn't search the faces for what she had lost. Instead, she looked only at the boy in boots, whose faith had given her courage, and at the man beside him, whose steady presence had begun to mend her broken places. For the first time, she knew she hadn't been waiting for nothing. She had been waiting for this. And when the boy slipped his small hand into hers and the father's gaze held hers with unspoken promise, she understood. Sometimes the love we are meant for doesn't arrive when we expect it, but when we are finally ready to receive it.